The public has a long-held fascination with detectives. Detectives see a side of life the average person is never exposed to. In this podcast series, I Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant, I'll be interviewing a whole range of people you come across as a detective, including police, bad guys and victims. I spent 34 years as a cop. For 25 of those years I was catching killers. That's what I did for a living. I was a homicide detective. I'm no longer just interviewing bad guys. Instead, I'm taking the public into the world in which I operated. The guests I selected have amazing stories from all sides of the law. The interviews are raw and honest, just like the world they inhabited. No one who steps into the world of crime comes out unchanged. Join me now while I take you into this world. This episode of I Catch Killers contains conversations that some listeners may find confronting or triggering. Discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Today's guest is a larger-than-life character who has stood out in her chosen profession. Like a lot of high-profile, successful people, she has her supporters and also detractors. I've known this guest for 30 years and consider her a good friend. She is ridiculously intelligent, a physical force of nature who mixes comfortably in all levels of society. She cares about people and is not afraid to speak her mind. There is no bullshit about her. What you see is what you get. Today's guest probably doesn't realise this, but she actually taught me what being a public servant is all about and what an important role that is in society. The accolades that have come her way is because of the hard work and her unrelenting drive to do her best with whatever task was put in front of her. Today's guest is high-profile barrister Margaret Canine, Senior Counsel. In her role as a Crown Prosecutor, she's put away some of the state's most notorious criminals. Throughout her career, she championed the rights of victims of crime and was not afraid to speak out if necessary. The understanding and the care she showed to victims of sexual assault was truly remarkable, and perhaps a little bit ahead of her time, considering what we're seeing play out in recent times about women's rights. Margaret also faced her own challenges when she was very publicly targeted and humiliated during an ICAC investigation. Margaret's now a defence barrister, working with the same passion and enthusiasm she had as a prosecutor. Margaret Canine, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Gary.
Well, you've always had a spot here, Margaret. It's just trying to find a time in your busy calendar to get you here. And certainly you haven't slowed down since crossing to the defence from the prosecution side.
No, it must be impossible for me to slow down, I think, Gary. It's very hard to say no to people when they need help. So many people have approached me to represent them and I try to fit them all in.
Yeah, I hope you're not running yourself into the ground because every time I see you, you're extremely busy. In fact, I think the last time I saw you was at the jury had just gone out for Kawinder Singh murder trial. And the facts of that case is that his wife died as a result of being set on fire. And that was a fairly horrific case and you were representing him, defending him. And I remember speaking to you because the jury had just gone out and you were very confident that he would be acquitted and you were in fact quite passionate about he should be acquitted and the jury only took a couple of hours to come back.
It was an honour to represent that innocent man. He should never have been charged and his prosecution was a disgrace. All of the scientific and forensic evidence, and there was plenty of it, pointed to a self-pour and a self-ignition by the deceased woman, not meaning to kill herself, but meaning to make a very small fire just to create a bit of drama because there was some disagreement with them about money. She had a lot of pressure on her from her own family. But all the fingerprint evidence, all the DNA evidence, and some of the more sophisticated fire evidence about timings between the petrol pour and the ignition, which was 5 to 10 minutes, all showed that Mr. Singh must be innocent. And he shouldn't have been charged and he shouldn't have been prosecuted.
That must give you a lot of satisfaction that you can use your skills to help someone in a position like that.
Yes, it was very, very satisfying. I'd known Mr. Singh and his family for about 18 months, and he suffered dreadfully because it seemed like something like a reverse sexism, because he must be to blame if his wife, if that happened to his wife, and also racist theory was coming into it, some sort of slur on Indian men that was certainly not justified in his case, or perhaps in many cases, but certainly not in his. He's an Australian who even went to high school here. And he didn't have a single blemish on his criminal record. He had no vices. Obviously, the police had looked for something, but in the end, the police didn't charge him until after a recommendation from the coroner. So he wasn't charged for 4 years.
Yeah, I remember speaking to you about it, and what you've just relayed then. You're very strong in your opinions of he shouldn't have been charged, and speaking to him, because I actually met him while we were waiting for the jury, or he was waiting for the jury to come back, and what a terrible situation to be in. And that is the power of the courts, isn't it, really? The power of the police,
goodness.
And if the courts get it wrong, people's lives are affected. So,
well, fortunately, the courts, especially at that level, generally do get things right.
Yeah.
That's
comforting.
It's very comforting, and a jury of 12 is a very intelligent, wise body of people.
And it's interesting that you said, like, perhaps racism came into it with this ignorance of perceptions that, we hear of violence between men and women in India, and that might have played into the thinking. But congratulations. So that's you're still doing good work, whether it be the prosecution side or the defence side, and you've still got that same passion.
Yes, I really do. In fact, it has been easy to transition, as it were, because I've still got someone to look after. I used to think that I looked after the victims of crime, poor children or poor bereaved parents of people who'd been murdered. There was someone to look after, and now I still have that with people quite often falsely accused of crimes.
Well, this podcast is about trying to find out who Margaret Canine is. So that's my last experience with you, defending someone in a murder trial, and the person was acquitted. Who was Margaret Canine when you were growing up? And why did you head towards law? What dragged you towards law?
I was a pretty quiet, timid sort of kid, really. And I read a lot.
I find that hard to believe. But anyway,
it's a long time ago, Gary. Yes, we do. And kids aren't allowed to drink alcohol. So,
all right.
But I was very studious. I read books constantly, and law seemed to be the place where I was going to end up. I was a debater at school. Like most people, I was terrified of public speaking, but I just kept making myself do it to overcome that fear. But when I was first a lawyer, I used to have to put my hands in front of my body so that people behind me in the court wouldn't see how much they were shaking.
It is terrifying speaking in public, and I think anyone that says it's not is missing some sort of brain cell that doesn't warn you how much of a fool you can make of yourself when you're speaking in public. But so law, at what age did you say that's the career I want?
By early teens, I was thinking that way, because it looked to be a degree of some intellectual rigour, but still leading to a very important career. So that's what I wanted to do.
Yep.
And fortunately I did get into law, but I took what was even then an unusual path of joining the New South Wales government in the Attorney General's Department, and I joined there at the age of just 18,
right,
and started doing law at night that very same day.
That's a hard path.
Yes, but I felt as though I was in a hurry.
Yeah.
And remember, that was in 1977. So I did hope in my life to become a mother, which did happen. Yeah. And I thought, gosh, I might only have 10 years. I've got to pack everything into it. And working full-time and part-time study seemed to be the way to pack the most into the years that I had. But of course, as things worked out,
yeah,
I didn't stop.
No, well, you certainly haven't stopped, and you've been going hard at it for a very long time. So when you got your qualifications as a solicitor, you went to the DPP, or the DPP, it wasn't even called the DPP.
No, it wasn't.
Back in those days.
That's right. And in fact, I was working at when I was fully qualified at the Public Service Board of New South Wales, doing industrial law for a few years, for the first 5 years or so of being qualified as a lawyer. So I had quite a lot of advocacy experience. Yep. So in 1986, there were many amendments made to the law around the prosecution of people charged with child sexual assault offences.
Right.
In effect, it made it possible to prosecute those people. It had been so difficult before because children's words were not accepted on the same level and so forth. They had to be corroborated. Courts were reluctant to accept unsworn evidence from children too young to be sworn and so forth. So there were some differences made, and there was in the Clerk of the Peace Office, the Solicitor for Public Prosecutions and Clerk of the Peace Office, a new section opened up of solicitors who would assist complainants in child sexual assault cases to go through the journey of prosecuting the people who were alleged to have abused them.
Right, and that was your first experience on the prosecution side of the legal area? Yes,
that's right. So I went there and within a year the Director of Public Prosecutions was formed. But for so long the people in that section were always somewhat ridiculed. People would continue to say, "You're still doing that kiddie sex stuff." Yeah. And I'd like to throttle the person who first thought up...
And I think you're probably capable of it. But anyway, we'll talk about that later.
Thank you very mumuch. Who first thought up that pejorative expression, kiddie sex. In fact, it sounds like the work of a pedophile itself,
doesn't it? Does sound like a pedophile. If someone was rolling that out, it wouldn't surprise me if I was sitting opposite a pedophile.
Yes. It just sounds so inappropriate. And sometimes people still use it, but people didn't think it was really a proper part of the law, especially as there were more women involved in that part of the office than in other sections, and perhaps deliberately so, because many of these children, of course, had been the victims of males, and they were just more comfortable with women lawyers.
So it was an area that wasn't respected, and it was, if you're not cutting it in the other areas of law, you go there. And looking back now and looking at what we know about now, how wrong we got it.
It's pretty surprising, because anyone would have to say that it's the area where it's the most difficult to get a conviction, because especially in those days there were many historical cases coming through. That hasn't really stopped, surprisingly. Many cases went back many years, so it's impossible for police investigators to obtain things that they can obtain with a recent crime, like CCTV, which didn't exist then anyway. There weren't phone records then, so it was always one word against another,
and very much witness testimony.
Yes, and a child who often had some vulnerability that the alleged offender had taken advantage of, which did cut across their credibility too.
Right. Did you find that type of work satisfying?
I really did, because we started to get some justified convictions, and so that was terrifically satisfying. It was terrifically satisfying to give children a voice in court, and to displace a few beliefs, a few misconceptions about child sexual assault. I knew, even from my own experience, that child sexual assault can happen almost under the eyes of parents, and parents, certainly in the old times, and I was a child in the 60s, parents just didn't expect such a thing to happen, and they could hardly believe that it would. So because pedophilia and child sexual abuse was not spoken about, many good, decent people in society just would not believe that
they didn't want to
people
believe.
Were capable of it.
And Margaret, and you've raised it, and I was going to raise it, and the fact that you came out publicly and you had said that you were a victim of sexual assault when you were a child, and that's helped a lot of people, I think, when someone, your persona is that you're very much in control of things, and you're not a victim, and then you came out and said that you're in fact experienced being a victim as a child of sexual assault. Was that hard to come out and talk about?
Not really. I've often spoken about it to my friends and so forth. It was when I was so young, a preschooler up to about the age of 7, when fortunately the person involved died. But and I remember feeling very wicked about being glad about that at the age of 7. But
it can play with your head.
Yes,
it's
But I remain glad that he died then. But he took advantage of trust by my parents, and because he had a physical disability, and people didn't think that he would be capable of such a thing. Yeah,
it happened, and you hear so many stories of that people, that's just Uncle such and such. He's friendly, or it's a neighbour, and then you hear these horrific stories and things that kids have had to withhold.
But I don't know whether I'd be any different without that experience. Maybe it toughened me up in various ways. But also perhaps it allows me to convey to other people, well, you can get through it. It doesn't define you. It's just something that happened to you, and a lot of bad things happen to everyone in life. So
that's right, and it doesn't have to define you. But I think the important thing and how that contributed or helped to people is the fact that you came out and spoke about it. And there's a quote here that I've taken out from one of the many articles, and might I say this, Margaret, in preparing for this podcast, I had to do more reading than so many other people I've had on the podcast, because you certainly have a lot that you've done in your life and a lot that's been written about. But
it's extraordinary, isn't it?
We'll get through it.
I think it's because criminal law is so interesting, and the cases I have done are fascinating.
They are fascinating, the cases.
Holidays are so boring for me.
All right, you don't want to miss your work. But one quote you've publicly talked about, and I'll read this quote out. "I've been telling victims for years that the shame is not theirs. They did nothing to contribute to it, and it's not in any way their fault. I'm in no way at fault for what happened to me." That's very powerful when you say that, because you're basically telling the victims, don't blame yourself, as I don't blame myself. It's not your fault. Is that the intended message of that, what you said there?
Yes. It's possibly not as necessary to tell people that these days, but it was at the start, because some people in the time that I was young have had, who are my contemporaries, some people who've been victims of terrible systemic sexual abuse, were told by their parents, sometimes their mothers or fathers or other people, well, you shouldn't have kept going back there, you shouldn't have gone there. Well, not gone to school? Gone to Scouts, gone to somewhere where the parents sent them, be minded by someone the parents arranged. It's hardly the child's fault, and in those days too. This was something that was very important. Children weren't expected to talk about any sexual matters. If you started to talk about parts of the body or sexual activity, you were likely to get a good hiding. And it was very hard to come out with things like that, and certainly to allege something against some powerful member of the that is of the community, like a priest or a doctor. You didn't have any chance. Your parents probably wouldn't believe you.
Well, that's why people got away with it for so long, and it's only of relatively recent times that people are starting to say, well, enough's enough. And there's been people that have been called into account that 20 years ago they wouldn't have been called into account.
Yes.
But it's certainly something that you're renowned for, the support that you've given victims of sexual assault. And I say that, and I don't want you pigeonholed saying you're only supporting victims of sexual assault. That's just one aspect of the many things that you've worked on. But I know it counts. And one victim, again, a quote and something that's been written about you, has said in reference to you, she treats victims not as a victim but as a citizen whose rights have been trampled. and whose rights she intends to restore. What a great quote to have someone say that about you.
It's really gratifying. It's terrific, and that so I'm glad that I've been able to do that work.
Making a difference.
It was almost tailor-made for me, in a sense, giving a voice to people who mightn't have had it, and giving them a friend in court. Even though a prosecutor doesn't represent the main witness, who is the complainant, still it's much easier if you can communicate with the person.
I don't care what they say about courts, and I'm not informed enough to be critical of the courts, but I make this observation: there's nothing wrong in a court to have some humanity, and sometimes the courts forget that. But there needs to be humanity when people are confronted with situations that find themselves in court.
There's always room for compassion and kindness, and that goes for everyone, because courts are the most terrible experiences for everyone there, except the lawyers. But for all the parties, it's terrible. And anyone trying to put the boot in to anyone in that situation, really, they're just, what's wrong with them? Bullies, they'd call it these days.
I think they would, and they'd probably complain to the HR department, and things would happen. Some of the higher profile cases that you've worked on, there was the gang rapist, Bill.
Bill this Bill Alscaff and his friends and relatives. That
was a particularly horrific set of circumstances that occurred, and you were involved in the prosecution of that. How did you find that?
It was very well investigated by the police. It was probably the first sexual assault case that was investigated as well as a murder is investigated, because the allegations were fresh. There were mobile phones in play because it happened in 2000. So it was one of the first criminal cases, perhaps the first in New South Wales, where we had evidence from the technicians from the phone companies about telephone towers and even the sectors in telephone towers.
And that was all new, the criminal investigation, or was just coming in?
It was. And so that even though these people didn't travel very far in the scheme of things, you could tell what direction their phones were pinging off these towers. And so it was very easy to tell, when they said we were at home instead of at the park, for example, it was clear that that was false.
Yeah, and they were horrendous crimes that my observation of it, I wasn't involved in the investigation, but someone needed to stop them, or it would have continued on, most likely.
Yes, the terrible thing about them was that mobile phones became part of the weapon, because it wasn't just one episode of sexual deprivation against each victim. More people were brought along using the phones to continue the assault over hours and hours.
Yeah.
And so it involved many accused persons, and the relationship between them, and the poor victims, as indeed victims they were, suffered really dreadfully in the most frightening ways, with awful aspects. For example, the victim known as Miss C, who was a wonderful witness, considering how many people she had to identify, and it was remarkable how good she proved to be. For example, the man with the yellow jumper had a particular feature on his body, and that proved to be so. So you could see that she was getting it all right. But at the end of her terrible 6-hour ordeal, with about 14 men involved at different, in taking shifts as it were, she was hosed down on an August night and dumped.
Yeah, it's disgraceful, isn't it?
It really was.
And people like that need to be stopped.
Yes, and unfortunately that happened, and I remember the police commander at Bankstown telling me several years later that there had been no repetition after that. It really had a big it had a big effect, although there was a noted repetition in a slightly different area. And I also prosecuted the Kay brothers.
The Kay brothers at
Ashfield.
Yeah.
And who had even mentioned to one or two of their victims that we won't get caught like the Scaffs.
And you prosecuted them as well?
Yes.
Did it distort your view on human behaviour? Looking at that, because I'll sit here and call them a pack of animals.
I like animals too much to
okay, that's a fair call.
That,
yeah.
But, they were young. The Scaffs and associates didn't have very high IQs, Gary.
Yeah.
They really didn't, and so there were very powerful psychological features there, and other sorts of features. But it was terrible. It was as though they didn't think that these lovely young women who had been nice and friendly towards them, who had been accepting of them. They didn't treat them as human beings.
Do you, and I found this in homicide, sometimes I'd see what families have gone through, and not just homicides, other cases and that, and sometimes the victims just teach me so much about life and just inspire me how they can get on with their life, and they don't let what's happened to them define them.
It's so inspirational. If I'm sure this has happened to you too.
Yeah.
If we're down about some setback, we can call to mind half a dozen people straight away who have been through so much worse and yet who face life resiliently and positively. They've lost loved ones in the most terrible circumstances, which has got to be the worst thing ever. So it certainly puts any other setbacks or tribulations right in perspective. So it makes me very, very grateful for my life.
Yeah, I agree with you, Margaret, and people often say, look, how do you cope with this? How do you cope with that, with what you've seen? And because you do see the dark side of life, but the inspiration I can draw and the strength I draw from some of the people that have been through horrendous things and still have a positive outlook on life.
It's terrific. So aren't we fortunate to have mixed with those people and to be able to draw from their strengths?
Yeah, I think so. A couple of high-profile cases. I could sit here all day, but I'll talk about another one while we're talking about pedophiles, or we were talking about pedophiles. Dolly Dunn.
That was another first, because he had kept trophies of his assaults on boys, and we learned, and that they were movies of the actual assaults on video cassette. I've never seen anything so terrible. I had 3 little sons at the time I prosecuted him, and I kept seeing one of my sons in the face of one boy whose face you could clearly see while he was subjected to the most horrendous sexual assault that you could imagine. 7 years of age he was, with Dunn.
And he kept videos of that as a trophy.
He had a tripod set up so that he and the child was in the foreground.
Yeah.
Wincing, pulling faces in pain.
Yeah. And
yet, what we could also learn from that was that children who were groomed in a successful way, and I don't mean a positively successful way, but children who were groomed into these situations cooperated. So they would perhaps remove their own shorts, and get into a particular position, because they'd done it before, they'd been trained and groomed to do it, and been rewarded for doing it.
Yeah.
And so that was some learning in that area, because sometimes it was said, oh well, he took his own clothes off, and you couldn't even imagine that anyone would. But we saw how that's how inured to that type of.
I've dealt with pedophiles and locked pedophiles up, and I still remember ones that have said to me, But you don't understand. She enjoyed it, or he enjoyed it, and despite the fact that they got a knife at the person's throat or the child's throat. But that's what's so creepy about pedophiles, is that they manipulate the vulnerable, and the vulnerable being the children.
And they have no acceptance that it's wrong.
Yeah,
they think we're wrong.
Yeah,
they think children have a right to enjoy a sexual life with them.
Yeah,
it's so sick.
And some of them do say that, and it's almost like it is their right, and they look at you thinking, "Why are you stopping me doing this?"
Yes, but, and even why are you stopping this kid from having such fun?
Yeah, with Dolly Dunn, he was extradited. He tried to flee, and I think it was Honduras where he was extradited from to America.
He was,
yeah,
and he anyway was brought back. And the other novel thing for the Times was being able to tender these videos to prove the case. Really, he could never deny it because of and so that was one of the first cases where we proved the case. We didn't really have to trouble the victims, except for formal matters like their age and so forth. But we tendered the videos, and at first the judge wouldn't watch them. And he's saying, why can't I just read a narrative about this?
Right. And that's interesting.
Yes, and I said, you have to watch it. If it was CCTV of a bank robbery, you would watch it. If it was CCTV of an assault on the street, you would watch it. So because if a picture's 1,000 words, this is 1,000,000 words. You have to watch it. So the judge did watch it, and the penalty
reflected
what he thought.
That's interesting that the judge didn't want to watch it, and I find that it's so confronting. People don't want to address it. Where people, if a child reports something, it's I won't say it's just too much trouble, because it's not that, but it's almost too confronting. People don't want to be confronted with it, and I think that's why these pedophiles have got away with what they did for so long.
That's true, and connected with that is the fact that in the community still didn't believe it or didn't understand it. But once some good journalists could report on what they saw in these films, then the people who were reluctant to believe it came around to accepting that child sexual assault did exist, did happen.
Yeah.
Many people just would not accept it and thought that, and just didn't want to know about it. But not anymore.
Did you also headed up a commission in Newcastle?
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about that?
That was called by then Premier O'Farrell in 2012 and went until 2014. Most of the hearings were in 2013. It was to investigate the police investigation of some priests in Newcastle.
Yeah.
The priests were dead by then, but I had to investigate whether the police had done a proper job of investigating the matters at the time. And what we found out was that the police weren't really involved in investigating it until the very end in each case. And one of the priests had been properly investigated and prosecuted competently and had done time in jail and had died in jail.
Yeah.
Another was very old and was never quite apprehended. But in quite a lot of the cases of priests where victims genuine victims had come forward about priests many decades later, sometimes it was the case that the police that the children had told their parents, but the parents wouldn't believe it, or the parents didn't want to go to the police because they didn't want the church to be besmirched by these allegations. And so they sometimes were the sorts of parents to say, look, we're not saying anything about this. It's not so bad. And I think it was very hard for the parents to accept that priests had offended. So that was so the police weren't really told at the time in any of those cases.
Got to the formal
report. And when they had been told, as we found out, the end of it was that there was a magnificent detective. He's now an inspector, but he was Detective Sergeant Jeff Little, had put together the most comprehensive brief that I'd ever seen. So there had been a great deal of work done in that area. In the area of pedophile priests in Newcastle by the police. There had been no cover-up. In fact, there had been a brilliant investigation which was just about to be sent to prosecution. And it was, and everything was most successful, so we couldn't find any fault there with the police. But there had been some cover-ups in the church.
Right. Do you, having worked, and we've talked, and there's so much more to your career, but we're talking about the sexual assault side of it, the sex offenders and that, and heading up the commission as well. Does it distort your view on things that we held in high regards? Whether it, and I'm not talking a specific denomination. I never get that word out. I'll try that again. We're not talking specific churches or scout groups or whatever, but when you look at it, these were the so-called pillars of society. Has it distorted your view?
Well, I'm a Catholic and still a very faithful one. I just regard pedophile priests as complete imposters in the religion. Yeah. Complete imposters. It doesn't do any damage to my relationship with God, not at all.
Right.
But so anyone who behaves like that as a so-called priest is not a priest.
You're not judging the organisation, you're judging the individual.
That's right.
Okay, well that's fair enough. How many, we'll talk other trials that you've done, or an area that I want to speak to you about, because now you've gone from prosecuting to defence and cross-examination in courts. So we're talking general. It doesn't have to be a specific case, but as a detective, I find cross-examination some of the most intimidating area you can find yourself in. You feel like the whole world's watching you. You're in the witness box and you've been beat up by someone like yourself, a very skilled barrister. What have you learnt about cross-examination, and is there a different way that you approach it from a defence point of view or a prosecution point of view?
It's remarkably similar.
Yeah.
It's you just know what you want to get from the witness. You know the weaknesses in what they say, or what parts of what they say don't fit in with your case theory, and that's what you burrow into. And and sometimes cross-examination can be just getting someone talking about a particular area where you know that their misconception, as you would see it, or lie, is involved. So you might just get them talking until they trap themselves in a particular area. So cross-examination, I don't think you can teach it.
It's interesting you say that, because I agree 100%, and it's not the same, but interviewing a suspect, I have some detectives that have got a natural instinct for it that I've worked with, others that you could lock them in a classroom for 2 years and try to teach them, but they don't understand what the whole process is about. You had a reputation as being a fierce person to be cross-examined by, and not in a negative sense by any way. I know from a police point of view, when you were on the case, a matter that we had before the court, if you were on the case, people thought highly of you because you would cross-examine people in the witness box. To me, there has to be a lot of preparation for it. I've seen some solicitors, barristers go at the cross-examination, and I'm sitting there in the witness box, and it's clear to me within the first 5 minutes they haven't done their research because they don't know the detail of the matter they're trying to explore. What was your secret to being a good...
It starts at the start of the case, really, because something that I've always tried to do, and I'm sure I think you may be able to confirm this. When I meet the person who's bringing me the case, when I was a prosecutor, that was the lead detective. As a defence counsel, it's the solicitor who is briefing me. I want to impress them, I think, by what I know already of what they've sent me, and so I ask them what are the important things, what do we have to prove here, what are our obstacles, which witnesses are the ones that we have to perhaps try to move or discredit. So it starts at that early level, and so that becomes your focus. And so with a witness statement, for example, you can go through it and circle the things that you can't live with in your case, and so you can do it from that. I don't think you can write out a cross-examination.
No. Well, therein lies a mistake if they do, because it
can go anywhere.
It goes anywhere.
So you just have to have the points that you have to get with this witness.
Yeah.
So you've got that in front of you, and you tick them off as you demolish each one.
That's what it felt like sometimes. I know sometimes I get out of the witness box and you haven't done anything wrong. You know your evidence, but you still get out and you feel like you've been ripped apart, because there are some very skilled barristers that can twist things that you say or whatever, or exploit things, and you come out battered and bruised.
Wording's so important, and a loose word, if it's a bit ambiguous, can be hung around your neck.
I've had plenty hung around my neck, and I think I've said it on the podcast before. I always wear a white shirt when I go into the witness box, because I hate getting out with unsightly sweat stains when I've been carved up in the witness box. And the other thing that I learnt as a detective, and you'd laugh because you know what's coming. When I was sitting in the witness box and the defence barrister was complimenting me, saying, "Well, you're a very experienced detective, aren't you? And you've been doing this for a long time." If he or she is talking me up too much, I know I'm about to be hit over the head with a lump of wood. And so as they continue to praise my work, I start to diminish my work and go, "Oh, I'm not that experienced," because you know the.
I make mistakes too. Do you now? Yeah. And I'll take you to one now.
Yeah. So you know that it's coming, but. One thing that you said, and I'll just take you back to that when we're talking cross-examination, I think this is what, in my mind, and everyone's got their own opinions, but in my mind, separated the type of legal person you were from others, in that as a detective, you would consult with the detective that was running the case. Now, I've worked on cases where I've been running a case for 20 years, and I have a legal person come in that I call it intellectual arrogance. They can't even bothered speaking to me about what my thoughts are, and if they're that brilliant that they don't need to speak to me and perform in court, it's fine. But I've seen it too many times, time and time again, when they haven't even bothered asking me a question, or any member of my team, and then completely miss the facts. And I'm sitting in court and they're talking about something that's completely wrong, and they haven't even bothered asking.
Gary, I can't believe it. What a waste of the most important resources you've got, because I always knew that the detective had been working on this case for the last maybe 3, 4, maybe more years.
Yeah.
And I've just come to it.
Yeah.
And with a stack of folders, you've got to get them in. What's the most important thing? What do you think about this? Because there are many things too that are between the lines. You can't even write them. They may be intuitive feelings that the detectives have, and that might be the key to proving the case beyond reasonable doubt, if it can be extracted from witnesses.
Yeah.
So you need that resource. I find that, I'm not surprised. Some lawyers, I think, don't understand that there is a discipline and called criminal investigation that you have to learn.
Yeah.
There is theory and there is practice. And I don't know any lawyers who've done that. Unless they were police before.
Yeah, I agree 100% there, Margaret. And I think sometimes they hide behind, but their role is to be impartial. And but I would always defer to a legal person, but they need to be an informed legal person. So don't start talking about a case that I've worked on for 20 years without at least consulting with myself or other people that have been involved in the investigation. And I must admit, it was when I walk into court, it was a sense of frustration, because I know that there could be so much hard work that's done by a team to put the brief there, and then because the people presenting the case haven't bothered speaking to you or fully understanding all the dynamics of the investigation, that the truth of the matter is lost in the way it's presented.
It's absolutely crazy. The best thing that I can have is as a prosecutor, was a detective who I'd say, okay, what is it about? And they just go bang, bang, bang from the most important down to the least important. You could get what you really are focused on. Otherwise, you've got 20 folders in your office and you don't know where to start.
Yeah. It's and that's I think part and parcel of the frustration police have for the court system. Again, looking, and I like talking because it's great because you've seen it from both sides now, prosecution and defence. I will always think of you as a prosecutor, but I'm warming to the idea of defence, given the fact that you had to defend me, so it was probably timely that you became a defence barrister. But what about the investigations, the way briefs are put together? And we're talking criminal briefs here, and I think given the service and given the type of work you've done, you're well placed to make a comment on the way evidence is presented to the courts. Do you see a change?
Well, it's always been the case that murder investigations are very, very competently done, generally speaking. And particularly if the specialist homicide investigators are involved. Of course, you get a great standard of investigation there. There may be, going back to the days before science, before telephones, before CCTV, before DNA, detectives had to be pretty good in those days too. I mean, they really had to be good. And so one hopes that investigators don't just rely so much on the science, we've got all these phone calls and here they all are, and we've got all this CCTV, here it all is, and not really investigate themselves, have a proper case theory, get what they can to support the raw science, get the proper input from human observers, human witnesses. So it's to be hoped that doesn't lead to some sort of complacency, that we can just rely on all of this science, because you still need to put the science together with people. And so
that's a very interesting take on the situation, Margaret, and I agree with you. I think the skills, and I was fortunate enough to come in the criminal investigation just at the tail end of where we didn't have all this data, all the electronic data. The only thing that you had to do if someone was murdered to check records was to see who they phoned on their home phone, and that was the type of thing. But I think there is a skill set that may been diminished or lost, that police aren't doing when I say police, I'm talking detectives investigating crimes here, doing what was the heartbeat of a criminal investigation, going out, speaking to people and getting their version of events locked in. And
yes.
Sometimes I think we're looking at, we'll wait till the electronics comes. I don't want to speak to that person because I want to see what phone records they got. How about lock them into a version of events and then prove or disprove the information they've provided by the other scientific evidence that comes in.
Certainly, because things may not always be what they seem. On a text message might mean many things, for example. CCTV, well, that's very good evidence, but sometimes it's quite selective, and we need to know what happened immediately before and immediately after. We want the people who were there to have a version, so that it's not just a snapshot; it's a whole story.
Yeah. You're also, there's been, and we'll get onto the controversy because when I'm talking Margaret Canine, you can always find the controversy. That's not hard. But you're always thought of someone that prosecuted very hard, and there was some criticism of the way that you prosecuted in varied things. And I've heard it even said you're almost like a zealot in the way that you prosecuted matters. But then, this is what I know, then I see you as a defence barrister.
Am I a zealot again?
You're a zealot again. Can you be a zealot on both sides? To me, it just shows me that you're passionate about what you did, and it was nothing wrong. You prosecute when your job was to prosecute. You prosecuted. Your job now, is defence, and you're defending people. Do you care to comment on that observation?
Yes, thanks. Well, gee, when I was prosecuting people where it was very, very clear to me and ultimately to the jury and everyone that the person had committed a very serious crime, well, you've just got to make sure that justice is done. That has to be the role of the Crown Prosecutor. But the Crown Prosecutor should be a minister of justice and doesn't, as I said before, doesn't represent the complainant or a victim if the crime is proved. A prosecutor has to represent the whole community, and that includes the accused person. And so there have been times, quite a few times, when I have seen that the prosecution may be a bit misconceived. In the DPP, you can put something up to discontinue that prosecution if you get a sense or you're told directly that someone has lied about that person. So, I've been just as passionate to make sure that justice is done. Well, now, a prosecutor, a Crown Prosecutor in New South Wales, has to serve many masters, an officer of the court, the director, the community, and so forth, and the bar rules, which are more stringent on prosecutors. A defence counsel only has to serve one person, really. There's duty to the court, of course, but you only have one master, and that is your client. And I have had the privilege to represent some innocent people in just the 2 and a bit years I've been a defence counsel. I mean it. I really have. And so of course I'm very zealous about that, because some have been the victims of perhaps a push to charge every man where there's any allegation involving a woman, no matter how lacking in credit she might be. That's not doing anyone any service either. It's certainly not fair to any party to be running prosecutions where there's no prospect of conviction. It's not. It should. The Director of Public Prosecutions has a filtering role between the police and the courts, and that should be taken seriously. And not every case that the DPP gets should go to prosecution. There should be a percentage and a reasonable percentage of cases where, as you say, the independent role of the DPP should be to say this will not proceed, because the courts are clogged up enough, and the DPP should not lose its reputation as an organisation that runs pretty strong cases. Yeah.
So you're denying being a zealot, or you're admitting to being a zealot, but you're a zealot
for justice,
for every side of justice, not just prosecution.
Yes, and of course it's not my decision. I am not the person who decides whether people are guilty or innocent.
No.
But you do get a very good sense after all these after decades and decades of picking up briefs. What is a strong case and what isn't.
But and the reason I'm raising this, Margaret, is that I know that and criticism hurts. We take it. It gets to the point where you just let it go. But the thought that you were just focused on prosecuting people, because I've seen that other side of you, even when you were in the DPP, and it just seems unfair that people can just hide behind and go, oh, that's Margaret, she's gone too hard on this. But you looked at each individual case. Yeah,
you've got to form a view. It certainly helps. Yeah, if you're if the work you have to do conforms with your personal view, not that your personal view should really matter, but if we're here to try to get justice, well, we should try hard.
I think that's fair enough. I think that's a good comment. How many murder trials do you think you've been involved in?
100 or more. I was fortunate to get into doing murders pretty early in the piece, because particularly if they involved children as victims, because I think it was recognised that I'm very, very compassionate with mothers who have been through terrible things. So I've done many of those, and they're the cases that stick with me when I have helped parents through murder trials involving the deaths of their children.
Yeah.
What could be worse?
Yeah.
What could be worse?
I don't think there is. It's you talk about it and they do stick with you. Cases like that, you can't sort of let them go. Not in a negative sense, but it's life at its worst, isn't it, when something like that happens? It is,
and even then, because then the focus becomes on getting justice for that dead child, and even then when there is a conviction and there's a sense of some sort of triumph, I think, especially for those poor bereaved parents, but they haven't got their child back.
Yeah.
So it's still a completely empty victory, if it is a victory.
Well, and victims have taught me that, and Mark and Fate Levison, because I would
what beautiful people
they are. They're fantastic people, but I had used during the course of my career the word closure when we're talking about cases, victims and all that, and they quite rightly pointed out to me that you never get closure when you lose a loved one, and I've taken that on board, and I'm very mindful about that. You can help them in some regards, but it's not necessarily closure that it brings. But I think the fact that people are going to court and have someone like you that actually, again, that word humanity comes into it. Talking about controversies, and I'd probably put them under the wrong heading. They're just little blips.
They're someone else's problem. It says more about them than me.
Margaret, I can't sit here in judgment of someone that controversies. We've all got some. Anyone that works hard is going to have a controversy. But you did a talk up at University of Newcastle. You were asked to speak to law students. I think it was the Sir Ninian Stephen lecture at Newcastle University.
2005.
And I think you got people's attention there, and there was some criticism that flowed from that. Do you want to talk to me about that?
Yes, I was very honoured to be asked to do that by the Dean of the Faculty of Law in Newcastle, because previous speakers had been Chief Justices and people of tremendous legal standing. But one thing that the student body wanted to hear about was the SCAF series of cases, which weren't quite over, which was an horrific thing, really. 5 years later, they weren't over because one by one they'd go to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and a new trial would be ordered, and so forth. And so, even though I declined even to name these people, part of my message, and it was quite a wide-ranging lecture about doing good with your power, the power that you have as a lawyer, being good with that power, and not entering into a war of attrition with people who were, on any view of it, victims of crime, even if there was a dispute about who had committed the crime, which is legitimate. These poor young women were victims of horrific rapes, whoever it was who might have been guilty. There was no doubt about that. And yet they were being brought back time and time again to do more trials. Yeah. And they couldn't get their lives going. Yeah. And so I was a bit animated by that, and saying, and that was my message. Even though amongst that message was, I think I said something along the lines of, a wrongful conviction would be to a prosecutor his or her worst nightmare.
Yeah, so it was balanced. Your opinions, but balanced. But if you take a little snippet, and I've read the transcript from your speech, and it was lengthy. It was covering off on all sorts of things.
Yes, taking challenges and all that kind of thing. And it was very well received, and the Dean said it was... Well, it was great. It was pertinent to what the kids wanted to hear, but because it touched on the never-ending trials and retrials involving the SCAF gang, and I didn't mention their names. Yep. Two people complained about me. two solicitors. They each complained about me, and one of them had a big interest in me not proceeding in that case because he had a client involved in it. And so it was obvious what the complaint was about. And it was amazing. The next day, the controversy was on. I was driving back from Newcastle, and the Premier, Mr. Carr, got on the because I think the Telegraph ran some of picked some out, and the complaints came thick and fast. And the Premier, Mr. Carr, said. They said, "What do you have to say about Prosecutor Cunneen saying this?" And he said, "I agree with every word she said." I said, "Oh well, I guess I won't get sacked."
Someone's backing you up. But I went through that speech the other day, and a lot of what you said resonated with me. And I think if it wasn't. Portions weren't taken out of context, it's a perfect message and an inspirational message to give to law students. But I
don't think many prosecutors dare to go and give any speeches to law students. Well, and so isn't that a shame?
That is a shame. That is a shame. But can I just read out the last paragraph of your speech, because I want people to really put into context the message that you were sending out to the law students. So this is a quote from your speech. What I wish to challenge you to do in your practice of criminal law is to bring your sense, your humanity and your conscience with you. Justice isn't achieved by ambush, trickery, dragging proceedings out in a war of attrition with witnesses. It's achieved by honesty, balance and preparation. As lawyers, you have a power. Be good with it. How dare you suggest that humanity should come into the court system, Margaret? What were you thinking saying that?
Well, of course, when people make complaints, there's an agenda, and the agenda was readily discerned. But it turned out to be a successful campaign because a court 2 years later, the Court of Criminal Appeal said that I should not be allowed to prosecute one of the retrials, which was still going on. And so I didn't, and the victim didn't come forward because I wasn't in it anymore, and the case failed. However, the particular accused in that matter didn't get out of jail because he was in for others. So anyway, he was acquitted of that one.
Well, I say good on you for standing up and if you're called in to do a lecture at a university, you want to leave an impression. That's why you get called into a university. And I dare say that you inspired a lot of people to go on to bigger and better things. So the ripple effect's probably playing out to this day, and they're probably out there now, and you might have inspired them.
Some of those students are briefing me now. So it's wonderful.
Well, there you go. Now, we're coming up to the concluding for part one, but one thing I just want to, well, not one thing, but how you cope. What's your coping mechanisms? Now, I know you like to have a drink, but we won't discuss that.
I'm getting thirsty, Gary.
No, it's not before midday yet. But you're also a martial artist.
Oh, yes, I am actually. I'm a fourth Dan black belt in Taekwondo, but I don't do so much about that. I think too many beers has made me forget the patterns. Right. Now I really like, and I know you understand, boxing.
Oh, it's great, isn't it?
It's terrific. It's a very efficient workout. So I do that 2 or 3 times a week. I go to the gym and do a few weights.
And it's when you put yourself in those challenging positions, I find that because people ask me, when you're under pressure, how you cope with it. But if you walk into a boxing gym or with your martial arts, I found that with martial arts, you've got to switch off, because if you don't switch off, you're going to get kicked in the head. And as a fourth Dan Taekwondo, if you're concentrating on what you're doing at work the next day, you're going to get your teeth knocked out. So,
Yes, that's so true. Even with doing routines of boxing, if I have one thought about about the next day's court or something, I get the moves wrong. It's amazing how you have to be so focused for boxing.
It's fantastic. It really is, and it helps me. And I think people they see the energy that you put into the work and wonder, where's the low points? And I've seen you when you're tense, like I've seen you at a court matter when things aren't going your way. But one thing about you, and I think this is why people gravitate towards you, and possibly some of the detractors, don't quite like who you are, is that you've got this positive energy. So court can be a very down environment, especially when you're doing a murder charge or a complex sexual assault trial. It can suck the life out of you. And when I've seen you around the courts, you've always had a positive outlook, and you've got time for people.
Thanks. I think that's right. I do like people very much. I think it's almost part of one's duty in life to be positive and cheerful, and try to give people some of that energy. And I'll keep doing it. I think that in itself almost annoys some people, that they can't wipe the smile off my face.
Yeah, that does trouble people. We've kicked you, we've put you in your place, and you're still smiling.
Yes. Well, I'll just keep doing it because I can see how hideous the people who never smile or laugh become.
Exactly. Best form of vengeance. Have a good time. Look, I think that's probably when we'll finish off part one. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of your high-profile cases, and we'll probably throw in a few more controversies just to keep things interesting.
Thanks, Gary.
Speak soon.